It's time for Banking on Solar. This is your host, Bart Frischknecht. Solar developers, investors, and lenders risk losing projects when they bog down during financing. Banking on Solar is the podcast community where energy transition project financing stakeholders share lessons learned so that more projects get built. Welcome to Banking on Solar. On today's episode, I'm answering a question that I hear more and more. People are curious about what podcasts will help them stay up to date and learn more about solar, project financing, and the energy transition. You'll hear a breakdown of my favorite podcasts in solar and around the renewable energy industry. Now, on to the show. Today, I'm excited to break down 20 of the podcasts I'm learning from these days. 20, I know that sounds like a lot. And I'm amazed that there are actually many, many more podcasts out there that are great, and I'm discovering all the time, touching solar, energy transition, and all of these topics. So there's more to dive into. When it comes to this podcast, the Banking on Solar podcast, I'm focused on supporting professionals in the commercial and industrial, community, agrivoltaic, and utility solar space, rather than residential, for example. So I won't spend much time discussing podcasts that are focused on the residential solar industry. This is a huge industry, and the podcast industry around residential solar is also huge. So you'll have to find another source if you really want to dig into the details around residential solar. Similarly, the overview that I'm going to share today is focused on podcasts that are actively producing new episodes. There are a number of shows with great back catalogs of episodes that aren't actively producing new content today, and you can find those in all of the podcast hosting platforms as well. Like any good list, I know I'm missing good entries that should be on this list. Send me a note and let me know what else I'm missing and what I should add to my playlist. I look forward to hearing from you. What I found is that you can break down podcasts focus on the energy transition and solar specifically into a number of categories, primarily based on the scope of the topics covered. These categories include specifically solar and renewable energy project finance, but also solar industry news, the solar industry in general. Podcasts focus specifically on interviewing industry leaders and looking for leadership takeaways and leadership potential. Some that are commercially focused that are very explicitly tied to specific manufacturers, vendors, providers, and the new things they're doing in the industry. And then some that are broader energy transition podcasts, often with an economics and policy focus. Finally, there are a number of international podcasts focused on the same topics. Most of the podcasts I'm listening to today are US-centric, but there are a few international podcasts that have sneaked into my playlist, and I'll highlight those as well. These categories aren't mutually exclusive. And so you'll hear me call out some of these podcasts more than once when they fit into more than one category. One of the observations that I'll make right off the top is that most of these podcasts follow a similar format. The podcast will typically have one or two hosts, and then they'll interview a single guest or a small number of panelists. The format of these interviews varies across podcasts and within the same podcast to include things like studio interviews, recordings from live events, panel discussions, webinars, and conference calls. All right, let's jump into the first category, specifically solar and renewable energy project finance. I've got 3 podcasts that fit squarely into this category. One is called Experts Only. It's from Clean Capital. John Powers is the host. It's been going since 2017, and it is really trying to bring together guests that are going to give a perspective on the intersection of energy, finance, and innovation. And they have slowed down from their heyday, but they're still producing about an episode a month, it seems like. And lots of really great guests and interesting things there. Currents is a podcast from Norton Rose Fulbright. This is a law firm that is focused on project financing, all of these kind of things, and they produce a ton of content. They've been around since 2016, and they're producing about 2 episodes a month. This is a podcast that has a lot of in-depth discussions. They also sometimes will post conference calls and other really deep nitty-gritty stuff. Another podcast that has a bunch of finance-related content is called Crossroads, the infrastructure podcast. And like its name implies, it talks a lot about infrastructure, but specifically about clean energy infrastructure and projects. This podcast also has a number of episodes that are internationally focused, and so it's a good mix of US-centric and other content and helps to understand the project development space in the broader market. This podcast has been around since about 2019, and they're doing about 1 or 2 episodes a month these days. Next category is looking at solar industry news, and there are 3 podcasts or 4 podcasts that are really news-centric that I've been listening to. So one's Clean Power Hour, another is Factor This, another is the Energy Transition Show, and Energy Insiders. Clean Power Hour actually produces 2 episodes a week, and the hosts are Tim Montague and John Weaver. John jumps on usually on Thursdays to do a live show with Tim where they actually break down live on the show their thoughts on many of the news stories from the week. On the other day of the week that Tim releases a podcast, it's usually Tim doing a more in-depth interview with someone in the industry. This is a fun show to listen to, not only because it's a great way to get a recap on the news, but Tim and John are not shy about sharing their opinions and feelings about solar, about the energy transition, and about a range of other topics. You might not always agree with what they say, but they'll give you something to think about and something to react to. Factor This is another podcast that is news-centric. It really started in 2022 with the Oxen solar tariff case, where there are questions about how the U.S. will regulate solar modules coming from a bunch of different places, specifically focused on how China production is getting distributed around the globe. This podcast has moved on from only covering that one topic, although they revisit it, and that's really an important place to get the latest and greatest on that topic. But host John Engel, who is now producing this as a weekly podcast from Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy, is taking a bunch of different approaches with the guests that he interviews to get the latest and greatest on what's happening in renewable energy and solar. Energy Transition Show is a show without any sponsors, and in fact has a paid and free version of this podcast. The free version is shorter and gets cut off. And this is a podcast that's coming out about 2 times a month. You can subscribe and pay for it. You don't have to get much of the content. And Kristen Elder has a specific focus on keeping this podcast as a paid podcast directly rather than getting outside sponsors, with his goal of providing unique and open and objective perspectives from his team as they put this podcast together, as he interviews industry experts, policy experts, and others from around the space. Energy Insiders is a podcast from Giles Parkinson and David Leach in Australia, specifically focused on the energy transition in the Australian market. And I love listening to this show, not just because I lived in Australia for 4.5 years and it makes me feel like I can live in Sydney for a little bit while I'm listening to this podcast, but hearing what's happening in Australia gives so much better global context for what's happening in the US and around the world related to solar and related to energy in general. When it comes to podcasts that are focused squarely in the solar industry, one podcast stands out, and that is Suncast with Nico Johnson as the host. He is producing content twice a week, and one of those episodes is typically a bit shorter. One is a bit longer. He's interviewing folks from around the industry and has really made a name for himself in a platform that spans manufacturers, policymakers, developers, consultants, you name it. It's really great to hear the guests he brings on and to hear how they're all connected in helping move everyone forward. The podcast originally started out as a podcast focused on Latin America and the rollout of solar in emerging markets. But over time, it has really expanded to be more US-centric and more broad industry-based. Clean Power Hour, which we already mentioned, twice a week, also very squarely solar-focused. Solar Maverick Podcast is a podcast that's still active, although over the last year, not nearly as active as it was when it started in 2018. But Benoit Thanjan is still producing about 1 episode a month or so. And again, this is focused on solar, focused on talking to people that are in the industry and making things happen. 2 podcasts have a very specific angle as part of the thesis or the motivation around those podcasts to talk to leaders and pull out their history, their story, how they got to where they are, and what leadership lessons they've learned, on top of what makes them interesting to talk to as part of solar project development and as far as the energy transition and decarbonizing the planet. And those are Suncast. So Nico Johnson very specifically has these longer conversations where he'll dive into people's background and ask them to pull out the lessons they've learned. And then the other is Scaling Clean with host Mike Casey from TigerCom, where that whole podcast is built around this idea of interviewing leaders and learning from them what they've learned as leaders. So although Scaling Clean is all about leaders that are in clean tech, climate tech industry, the conversation or the focus of those episodes with Mike is really about what can we learn. There are a number of podcasts that are sponsored by companies or by industry groups that are very commercially oriented. I'm going to highlight one of those podcasts here, Contractors Corner by Solar Power World. This might be the oldest or longest running podcast that I have in this list. They started in 2012 and are still doing anywhere from 1 to 3 episodes a month. There's no real regular pattern, but this is a media group that is talking very directly and explicitly to vendors, contractors, manufacturers, developers, consultants about their business and about what they're bringing, what new updates they have, what is happening from their perspective as a way to get the word out around those companies. So although this is a clear, explicitly commercially focused podcast, it is still a great way to get direct information directly from these individuals about what they think is important and how their business contributes to the overall solar energy world and, again, to the broader energy transition. They're a big batch of podcasts that look further afield than simply the solar industry and the solar market. And I would categorize these as podcasts focused on decarbonization, focused on the broader energy transition. Often these podcasts have a much broader lens and are looking from an economics or policy perspective. EnergyCast is one of these podcasts. The host is Jay Dowenhauer, and he's been doing this since 2017 and is producing about 2 episodes a month. One thing I like about this podcast, in addition to the guests he has on, is that he asks his guests at the end of the show what their take is on a broad swath of energy technologies, everything from traditional fossil fuels to pump hydro to nuclear and everything in between. And so it's fun to hear the different responses and the different takes that people have on that show. Catalyst is a premium podcast experience. Shale Khan is the host. He's also an investor and brings his investor hat in his interviews, but is also very curious and is able to pull out from his guests their unique perspectives, not only on the specific technology that they're bringing to market or the specific role they play in the energy transition, but how these things connect to the broader industry. Interchange Recharged is one of 2 podcasts from Wood Mackenzie, the energy consultant, that I'm going to highlight here. Climate Avengers is a brand new podcast. Elena Folks is the host, and she is new to podcasting, but not new to entrepreneurship, not new to climate action, and not new to renewable energy technology. So she's a partner in a new venture fund that is focusing on making money while saving the planet at the same time. And this podcast effort is in conjunction with Nico Johnson and his group at Resource Labs and the broader Suncast media community. Really interesting to see how this plays out and if they add more podcasts to this group over time. Elena's got a unique perspective. It's definitely not the same as Nico's Suncast podcast. Another unique podcast in this group is one called Energy Terminal. This podcast was started by a couple of students, Michael Wood and Hope Pratt, as Duke University students wanting to make a difference for classmates and other young folks and other people, even like me, making a transition into the renewable energy space and the energy world in general by creating a podcast that bridges the gap between what students or new people in the industry know to what they may need to know to find their first job or to make a career transition into the energy industry. Interesting to note that this podcast is sponsored by Energy Dialogues. And if you look into the background of Energy Dialogues, a little bit different perspective than someone like Canary Media or some of these other folks that are very squarely focused on decarbonize as fast as possible. Energy Dialogues, on the other hand, is a group that is bringing a traditional energy industry to this broader conversation around energy transition. And you hear that with Michael and Hope as they do the dance with different guests and different perspectives. And it is valuable to have these dialogues happening between people with different perspectives and from all parts of the energy industry coming together and grappling with what it means to focus on the energy transition, especially since you have such strong views and such strong opinions and you don't always get those people talking together. The Energy Gang is the second Wood Mackenzie podcast that I'm highlighting here, and this is much more broad energy focus compared to the Interchange Recharge. Ed Crooks is the host of Energy Gang right now. He'll typically have one or more other panelists. These people typically tend to be university professors or other folks that are a little bit at a distance from the nitty-gritty details of taking action on climate every day, in the sense that they aren't necessarily a manufacturer or a project developer or someone at the DOE or other places. And so because of that, it gives them a little bit of breathing space to talk higher level around how they see economics and policy at play, how the different players are interacting, what that means in terms of not just a US-centric market, but a global market. Redefining Energy is another podcast that can take this broader view, and this podcast is specifically taking a European-centric perspective. Gerard Reed from Berlin, Lawrence Siegelin from London, they talk openly before and after they interview their guests. They react to what they learn. Finally, another podcast that deserves mention in this group is The Carbon Copy. Stephen Lacey is the host. They are producing weekly podcasts, and this podcast is sponsored by the same folks that do Shale Khan's Catalyst podcast. Shale Khan focused more on interviews with industry players and with much more of a private capital perspective. Carbon Copy, the goal really is to tell stories and to tell the world what's happening with the energy transition, what's happening with decarbonizing. I've made a note about some of the international oriented podcasts here, and so I just want to do a quick recap as a final category on the international podcasts I've touched on. So Redefining Energy, European Focus, Energy Insiders, Australia, Crossroads, an infrastructure podcast, much of it US focused, but Latin America perspectives being brought in on that podcast as well. There is one solar podcast, that residential solar podcast, that I listen to on a regular basis, and that is called Just Another Solar Podcast. And this is an Australian-centric. This podcast is just fun to listen to as you hear Luke Beatty, Carl Jensen, Nigel Morris rehash 2 times a month what's going on in the highly mature, highly competitive residential solar market in Australia. And yeah, lots of great insight around how a solar market is developing outside the US and how they're tackling some of the same issues that residential solar is tackling here, without me having to pick between the bajillion sales and other residential solar podcasts that are out there. That's it for the show today. What have I left out? In addition to shows focused on residential solar market, which I haven't touched on, there are a number of other podcasts that are sponsored by companies in the industry. And some of these take a broad view of the industry, and some are more narrowly focused on the niche that company is building. And I look forward to exploring more of these podcasts and others as I find them and sharing what I learn. So please send me your recommendations so that we can all learn together and get more solar built. Please subscribe to Banking on Solar or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform so that others can find the show and we can get more people banking on solar. If you have an interesting guest idea or an idea, something else you'd like to see on the show, please leave a voice message at the website bankingonsolar.media. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Bart Frischknecht, and this is Banking on Solar.